Okay, hi everyone. Welcome to week two. Thank you very much for all of your participation, your comments, and videos, and your paper from last week. I still have to look through some of them. I have to review them, and I'm hoping to do that in the next couple of days and then get some feedback back to you, especially about your papers. So look for that in the next couple of days. But since things move really quickly in the summer, I just want to start looking at where we're heading next. And what we're doing next is we're moving away from the modern period, or away from Descartes, and we're actually going backward to the very start of Western philosophy in ancient Greece. And in doing so, we're going to look at one of the first most famous philosophers. We're looking at Socrates as written by Plato. And so I have a few dates here. Socrates lived in Athens from 469 to 399. His students, one of his students, Plato, one of his most famous students, I suppose, from 429 to 347, and then one of Plato's most famous students, somebody we saw with Descartes for just a moment, somebody we'll see later in the term for a different purpose. Aristotle lived from 384 to 322. And so these three in particular form the kind of triumvirate of the most important, perhaps, ancient Greek philosophers founding the Western tradition. And it's not that there weren't any important philosophers after them, and in fact, there were some important philosophers before them. But nonetheless, they're often grouped in certain ways, so the people before Socrates are often just referred to as the pre-Socratics, which suggests just how important Socrates really is. And one reason for that is that Socrates takes what's known as a kind of ethical turn. In asking questions not just about the nature of the cosmos or the universe, or how it's constructed, or what are the basic elements, but asking how it is that we ought to live, and asking what kind of virtues we should cultivate, or what kind of vices that we should avoid, and further ideas that we're going to get into, both with Plato and Socrates, and with other philosophers. One other thing to note, just while I have these dates up, is that Aristotle, famous for many things, but also a tutor to Alexander the Great. The man, the man responsible for conquering a number of territories in and around Macedonia. Okay, so those are just some dates to keep in mind as we're moving forward. What I want to do is turn immediately to this first Platonic dialogue featuring Socrates, his teacher, and that dialogue is known as Euthyphro. Now, there are plenty of Platonic dialogues, and they're usually named after the main some of them at least, many of them are named after the main interlocutor, the person that Socrates is speaking with. And so in Euthyphro, the main interlocutor just is Euthyphro. So in order to go through this, I want to give a kind of structure in the same way that I gave some structural features to the Descartes reading. And to do that, I think that I want to focus on roughly 8 large ideas or large moves that occur in this Platonic dialogue. You'll find that in virtue of it being a dialogue between two people, it's a very different writing style. It's a different way of engaging in philosophical ideas than what we saw with Descartes. With Descartes, we saw that it was a meditation, which involved a kind of self-reflection or self-interrogation of what it is that he can know. Here we have a dialogue between two men about a certain kind of question. And the main question of the dialogue that I think you can pick out is just this question: what is piety? And so in order to get after that question, I want to break down the Euthyphro dialogue into roughly 8 large moves. And I hope I can do this fairly systematically. There might be a few outlets here and there. 8 large ideas, we'll say. So here's the first. Just starting from the beginning, it's important to know the setting. Here's Socrates and Euthyphro. They're meeting outside of King Archon's court, and they're there for a couple of different reasons. So you have to ask yourself, why is Socrates there? And why is Euthyphro there? Well, we learn that Euthyphro is there because he's about to prosecute his own father. Why is he going to prosecute his own father? He gives us a short story about how it's the case that his father is now being charged with murdering a servant, not of his, but of Euthyphro's. A servant who himself had, in drunken rage, murdered another servant. And so what happens is that Euthyphro's father, in some kind of anger or rage himself, binds the servant, takes him, I guess, out of the house or to another part of Athens or outside of Athens, binds him and leaves him in a ditch. And it's not until later that he asks, when he's sort of calmed down, he asks a messenger to discuss with some of his friends what it is that should be done with this man, but he neglects him in the meantime. And when the messenger goes to retrieve the man, he's found dead. And so Euthyphro thinks that it's the right thing to do, it's the pious thing to do in order to prosecute his father for this death. So he is there to prosecute his father. And I want to notice something before we even get to Socrates' concern about this. One of the brilliant things about Plato's dialogues in general, and this one in particular, is that he raises what seems to be a really large question, and yet he doesn't even address this large question upon which the entire dialogue hinges. What's the question? Well, in one sense, we can say, for example, that Euthyphro's father may have actively killed the man by binding him and placing him in a ditch. On the other hand, it's not the same kind of action as, say, directly killing someone. He didn't, for example, stab him. And in virtue of leaving him in the ditch, it's as if he neglected him in such a way or placed him into a situation in which the man was allowed to die. And even, so again, my point here is that even in this opening part of the dialogue, which is not really taken up, there's a kind of distinction which really matters, and which matters in other kinds of cases, for example, euthanasia, or cases in just war theory, or in plenty of others, in which there might be a distinction between letting someone die and actively killing that person. And the kinds of intuitions that we have about those cases, or what kind of blame or punishment might follow from those, might be very different. And so it is brilliant in a way that Plato brings this up as the story of Euthyphro, and yet that doesn't even form the main part of the dialogue. Now, Socrates is very surprised that Euthyphro is going to prosecute his own father. Euthyphro, of course, thinks that, well, one should prosecute the wrongdoer regardless of one's personal relation to the person, whether it's a brother or a friend or a father. It's a kind of higher form of justice, Euthyphro thinks, which is necessary. And so we learn from the beginning that Euthyphro thinks that prosecuting his father really is the right thing to do, or he sometimes says it's the pious thing to do. And I'm going to flip between these ideas, especially later, between what it means. I'm going to use these somewhat synonymously, the pious thing to do or the right thing to do. So Socrates questions, well, do you really know that this is the right thing to do? Do you know what piety is? And this is just the question of the dialogue. And Euthyphro is very straightforward. Yes, he says, I do know what piety is. And in this case, piety is prosecuting my own father for the death of the servant. And so this forms the basis for Socrates to begin interrogating Euthyphro. And it's either for a certain reason or under a certain pretense. What is that? Well, the reason that Socrates is outside King Archon's court is because he himself is about to be tried by a man named Miletus for two famous charges. And we're going to see these again when we read the Apology of Socrates later in the week. The two famous charges against Socrates are first, that he corrupts the youth, and secondly, and the more important one for our purposes right now at least, is that he's impious towards the gods. And so in setting up the dialogue, Socrates says, well, Euthyphro, if you are so wise in the ways of what piety is, such that you are very confident and know for sure that you should prosecute your own father because that's the pious thing to do, then please tell me what piety is so that I can use it in my own defense against Meletus. So, since I'm up on the charge of impiety toward the gods, I want you, Euthyphro, to become my teacher. And I, Socrates, will be your student. And so this is the first part of the dialogue, which is extremely important, and it sets up everything that's about to occur. The rest of the dialogue could be structured this way, I suppose. Euthyphro proposes a kind of definition of piety. Socrates undermines that definition, and he undermines it in a particular kind of way. He undermines it such that Euthyphro comes to see the reason for why the proposal is unsatisfactory, for one reason or another. And it's as if, and this is what Socratic questioning involves, this kind of Socratic method, it's as if the answer is coming out of Euthyphro himself. As if he knew the kind of answer all along, and Socrates is just pulling it out of him via his kind of questioning or via his kind of prodding or proposals. And so that in itself is really the structure, but of course we need to know the content of what Euthyphro's proposals are and how it is that Socrates undermines them. And so in looking at that, one of the first proposals that Euthyphro offers, so this is number 2 in the 8 steps, Euthyphro says, well, to prosecute the wrongdoer, that's prosecute. To prosecute the wrongdoer is the pious thing to do. And he gives a kind of example here. He discusses this myth of Zeus. Zeus who rebelled or took revenge upon his own father. And so in this kind of ancient myth in which Zeus's father, Kronos, had swallowed Zeus's children. And so Zeus found it the just thing to do, the right thing to do, to castrate his own father for Kronos eating his own children. And so Euthyphro uses this as a kind of basis for suggesting that one, prosecuting the wrongdoer, prosecuting one's own father, is the pious thing or the right thing to do. And Socrates says a few things about this. He says, first, do you really believe these stories about the gods in this way? Do you think that they're real, Euthyphro? And Euthyphro says, yes, I really do think that they're real. But then Socrates says something else, which is more important, and in fact is very typical for the way he starts off a dialogue with one of his interlocutors. What Socrates says is that, look, in prosecuting the wrongdoer, in citing Zeus in this way, you've given me an example of what a pious action might be. But surely there are other pious actions. Just prosecuting your own father or just giving the example of Zeus isn't what constitutes all pious actions. And what I'm after here is not just an example of what piety is. I need to know what a definition is. I need to know what piety is all told. And so Euthyphro sees the problem here. There really do have to be other kinds of pious actions. And so in order to come up with a better definition, they have to continue investigating what piety might be. And so I'll pick this up in just 1 second in the next video.